Hey, back again to talk about the second part of the Durkheim video. My sincere apologies for not getting this done yesterday, but I had a 9-year-old birthday party, right, to host, and that took a lot of my spare time unexpectedly. Went well, everyone had a good time. Outdoor movie night, big hit. So, in terms of thinking about Durkheim, elementary forms of religious life, to remember in this reading, he's making kind of two key points. Number one, religion is inherently social. What we are worshiping when we worship is the social, or at least that is a huge part of it. And the other thing that religion does is try to separate the sacred on the one hand from the profane, with the sacred being the awe-inspiring, the amazing, the otherworldly, and the profane being the everyday, the mundane. Okay? So in terms of starting, this origin of beliefs, right, he's trying to understand what we are actually worshiping when we are worshiping symbols. And he puts this up as like this idea of the totem, right? So there are these entities, these like physical objects that we may see as being a center of religion, but it's really that they are a symbol of something that is important, right? And so he starts on page 131, column 1. The totem is before all a symbol, a material expression of something else, right? But of what? Right? And so he wants us to think about this. So what he says is the symbol is effectively a material representation of something that expresses and symbolizes two different things. Again, on 131, the outward and visible form of what we have called the totemic principle or God, which he's talking about the belief here, and also the symbol of the determined society of the people and the belief, right? And so effectively, like these symbols, where they exist, they must uphold both the belief itself, but then also the importance of the people and the community. And so if one thing can symbolize both, and he argues that that is in fact what totems are able to do, if they can symbolize both the society and the belief, is that not because God and society are one? Okay? And this is on page 139. So again, this idea that perhaps what we are worshiping is in fact society. So I make this video much later than I intended, story of my life, right? But I'm making this video on Saturday where it's like college football day. I'm getting ready to watch the Ohio State game, which is one of my big fandoms, right? And in terms of thinking about like things that are sacred, right? In terms of thinking about like the gear, the Buckeye, the OH chant, like all these kinds of things that people who are fans of Ohio State have, like that both upholds the Buckeyes, right, the football team, which is this, in this case, in the secular case, our God, right, this thing that we worship, but it is also the community, because without the community, what would be that thing, right? And that is also true of faith. So when he gets to point, the section he calls number 2, right, Roman numeral 2, he talks again, he comes back to this point that we discussed in the last video about what is a God without worshipers, right? The God needs the worshipers for for support, right? So again, this idea that it is dialectic, that it is reciprocal, that they need each other. The community needs the God needs the community. And this is also true of society, he says. So again, now we're in column 2 of page 139. Now, society also gives us the sensation of a perpetual dependence, since it has a nature which is particular to itself and different from our individual nature. It pursues ends which are likewise special to it. But as it cannot attain them except through their own intermediacy, it imperviously demands our aid. It requires that, forgetful to our own interests, we make ourselves its servitors, and it submits us to every sort of inconvenience, privatization, and sacrifice, without which social life would be impossible. And so, like, here is where he really starts this kind of, again, like I called it in class, like the love letter to society, right? That society is so fantastical that it can't be without us, right? Like it needs us to perform it, right? Like there is no society without people. Yet it is so much bigger than us that it seems almost unrecognizable when we're thinking about it in that way, right? And so, you know, so again, like we serve it, right? Like we are its servitors, and it you know, kind of is this place where it's everything that is our sacrifices, it is our inconveniences, it is everything, right? But it is also the only way that social life would be possible, right? And so, you know, it is fantastical in that way. So religion then is slightly different because of, you know, kind of bringing in this belief system, but it's similar in that it is also another thing, Durkheim argues, without which social life would be impossible. And in part, that is why we are obliged to submit ourselves to the rules of conduct, of thought, which we have neither made nor desired, and which sometimes even contradictory of our most fundamental inclinations and instincts, right? And so this was on page 139. Column 2. And the religion, in part, is so special. And ultimately, society is so special because we are so much better together. And that is what he, you know, again, like he hits this time and time again in this passage, right, that we read, that is what makes the society, that's what makes society so special. Continuing on page 139, column 2. The empire which it holds over consciousness is due much less to the physical supremacy of which it has over privilege than to the moral authority with which it is invested. If we yield to its orders, it is not merely because it is strong enough to triumph over our resistance. It is primarily because the object is of venerable respect, right? And here what he is saying, that society kind of has this idea where it can get, in his words, moral ascendancy, right? But it is not because we think it can defeat us, right? Which, like, I think that, like, some early philosophers might have said, right? Particularly like Hobbes or like Machiavelli, right? Would say that, like, it is the power over the body, the corporeal power, the war power, right? That makes us kind of respect society. But that's not the case, right? It is, in fact, important because of this moral authority, this fact that it lets us come together and share beliefs strongly with one another. And that is why, and because of it, we give it so much respect, right? This idea that, like, we can come together, and as we come together, we value the same things. We hold the same things to be important. And that is just so amazing to us that we're like, yeah, like, let's do this thing, right? Let's do this thing that you want to do, society, because you are clearly more powerful than I am. We together, like capital we, W-E, capital like us, right, as a society, are so much more powerful than we are independently. You know, so he goes in forth and makes the strong claim again, society, religion is ultimately worshiping society, right? Any gospel really is just expressing the wonder of society. On page 140, column 1, it is society who speaks through the mouths of those who affirm them in our presence. It is society whom we hear in hearing them, and the voice of all has an accent which that of one alone could never have. Again, stronger together. So, if that's the truth, why don't we just worship society then, right? Like, why do we have to have religion? Why do we have to have gods? Why do we have to have totems? And he says on page, again, 140, social action follows that there are two circuitous and obscure, and employs psychological mechanisms that are too complex to allow the ordinary observer to see it when it comes. As long as scientific analysis does not come to teach it to them, men know well that they are acted upon, but they do not know by whom. So they must invent by themselves the idea of these powers which they feel in themselves in connection, and from that we are able to catch a glimpse of the way by which we were led to represent them under the forms that are really foreign to their nature and transfigure them by thought. Okay. Lots of, like, 1800s writing here, right? But what he's saying is that, like, yeah, we have the scientific nature. Again, we're in this time of the Newtonian revolution, and, like, people's brains can think about, like, cause and effect and can think about, like, data-based arguments, blah, 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 right? But scientific analysis alone and, like, the scientific logic does not necessarily let us see our place in it, right? And so we can see cause and effect, we can think about social science in the sense that like some influencers can influence outcomes, right? So that there might be those kinds of things. But in terms of being able to see our place in it, that is much, much harder for us, right? That we can see other people maybe being a part of this, but us, it's much harder. And so we must then, and I apologize, my cat is very rambunctious today, so that's the wonderful miso soup who has joined us for our discussion today. She loves Durkheim, apparently. But so we must kind of make an argument for why that is, right? If we can't attribute it to science and we can't kind of piece it together ourselves, well, it must be God, right? Particularly at this time. Remember, he's writing at like 1800. We're coming off the heels of like all kinds of religious transformations. People kind of faith has a much larger part in people's lives, and at least it does in secular 2021, kind of Puget Sound region, right? I mean, not to say that there aren't people in the world for whom religion means a lot, or even people in our community for whom religion means a lot, right? But it's different. And so they say that people effectively are putting this upon a God because it doesn't make sense otherwise, right? That society is so fantastical that unless it is supernatural, it just doesn't make sense that we could do this. It's so foreign, it's so transfigurative. The only way we can understand it is by making it supernatural. And so, we kind of go further on page 141 to think about a God. So we believe God resides within us and does allow us to experience the marvelousness of society. Because since society cannot exist except in and through individual consciousnesses, this force must also penetrate us and organize itself within us. It thus becomes an integral part of our being, and by that fact is thus elevated and magnified. So it is so fantastical, right, that we have to give it something greater than humanity. That humanity together doesn't make sense to just be a bunch of people, because, right, like, who are we? What can we do? But if we can make it something better than us, that's what it is. This is the part that always makes me tear up, so I will try to draw our attention to it without actually crying in this video, right? But like, my goodness, when I need to be reminded why I'm a sociologist, I go exactly to this part of Elementary Forms of Religious Life. There are like 10 different books, right? But this is one of them. So on page 142, column 1, this is Durkheim in absolute love or in absolute marvelous awe of society. We speak a language we did not make. We use interests and instruments that we did not invent. We evoke rights that we did not found. It is to society that we owe these varied benefits of civilization. It is these things that give man his own place among things. A man is only a man because he is civilized, right? And so when you think about all of these things, right, this idea that like we're communicating in this language that none of us had any part in creating. We're using technology that I think none of us had any part in, creating and contributing. We're existing in this political structure that none of us founded or in the big hand protect. I know a lot of us do a lot of things in like small scale to protect this democracy, right? But all of these things exist, like that people just did, right? Like you did this, right? Like, and this is amazing. And, he also, kind of talks about like this, and this is speaking to Marx too, right? In terms of what brings people together. And again, if we remember, Marx is telling us that it's labor that brings us together, right? That we have this commodity fetishism where we are brought together through these products, where we're like, whoa, this is amazing. Who knew that people could make these things? And like the invisibility of all the labor and the kind of like backhand knowledge somewhere in the back of our brain that like we know that it took all these people's labors and creativity to make it is what brings us together. Durkheim is saying, no, dude, right? What brings us together is this fact that like all of these people did this stuff where we can thrive and do, like we can talk to each other, we can, kind of use these same tools, we can have these same leisure activities. And like, we didn't do that, but it exists for us, right? And not only like, so yes, we didn't do it, but we can also transform it in ways that makes it different for those after us, right? And like, what is that if not awe-inspiring, if not like the true power of humanity? And so, kind of this idea that like a lot for him of this sacred, like these things that become sacred are those things that kind of pull back the curtain, so to speak, to the unifying effects of those. We get the impression on page 142 that we are in relation with two distinct sorts of reality, that a sharply drawn line of demarcation separates from them from each other. On one hand is the world of the profane things, on the other, that of sacred things. And so, like, we are trying to make sense of why this is so amazing, right? And only one part of how we do it is this idea of the sacred. In section 3, he talks about, he wants to go way more about the importance of community in religion. And so he talks about how these strong feelings can be unified. On page 143 into 144, he says, and at the same time, all this companion feels themselves transformed in the same way. And so by, I'm breaking from the quote here, but these are all people who share this religion or this faith tradition that he's saying, like companions, right? They express this sentiment in their cries, their gestures, their general attitude. Everything is just as though he really were transported into a special world, entirely different from the ones where he ordinarily lived, and into an environment filled with exceptionality, intense force that takes hold of him and metaphoricizes him. And so, when we think about religion, so I grew up in the South, right? And in the South, we have revivals. I don't know if there are revivals here, right? But revivals, basically like a church puts up a tent, and in the tent, people go and they, listen to music, and they listen to very intense, kind of powerful sermons, right? And like the whole point is to cause people to like recommit themselves to their faith traditions, right? And like these things just sweep over people to where, like in the American South, this is where we start getting the traditions of like people speaking in tongues, right? Or people move to dancing because of the power of religion. And like Durkheim is like, yeah, of course that kind of thing happens, right? Of course people can be moved to this because this becomes like this idea of like, we don't even know what's possible anymore, right? This community, and he's talking about community, right, society, but religion can shape us so much that it really makes us feel like it's got a hold of us, right, that it's turning us into something else. That then solidifies our group experience, because it is through this coming together of a group, and he's talking largely about believers versus non-believers, because ultimately he's still trying to understand the power of religion, that we see that these things are bigger than us. And he goes through this like huge kind of exhaustive talk about like totems versus clans and whatever. But like the big point here is that the ability of religion to create something bigger than us is what makes it so capital A, capital W, capital E awesome, right? All inspiring. That this is so different through religion. It's so different than the life that we may ordinarily lead. And so therefore it must be amazing. However, he does acknowledge that religion can live, on page 145, column 1, can live only in and through the individual consciousnesses that compose it. So ultimately, and again, Durkheim gets very framed as a macro guy, right? A very like structural top-down guy and theorist. He's very, collective in his orientation. But he says that like, this can only happen because people do it, right? It can only happen because people buy in. And without that, we wouldn't have any of this. We wouldn't have society. We certainly wouldn't have religion, right? We wouldn't have community. None of this is possible without people coming together and being able to share sentiment and values uniformly. 144, it is by uttering the same cry, pronouncing the same word, performing the same gesture in regard to some object, that we become and feel ourselves to be in unison. And so, like that is the part, remember, from the first video, if you watched it, right, Durkheim was talking about the power of the symbol and the power of the ritual, right? It is that we recognize and value the same symbol, that we come together and worship it in unison, that we are able to kind of build this community, right? So ritual has a huge importance. In the first video, I talked a lot about our commencement, but all of these kinds of ways, or not commencement, but also convocation, right? But both of them are very important rituals where we're coming together and we're doing these like very ritualized events, right, all together in order to try to show us, like, look at us be in unison, right? Like, look at us do the same thing that we did last year and the year before, and do it with incredible reverence so that we can build community as a part of it. So he makes a very important claim on page 145. Social phenomena are born not in individuals, but in the group, right? And so here, this is where he takes the turn back to the structural. But I think, and he's always structural, right? But I think that like what the point that I'm trying to like underwrite here and really lift up for us is that Durkheim alone is not just a structuralist, right? He is not just collective. He sees this happen. He sees society like, yes, society is primarily this like top heavy thing, this thing that like influences us and has like force over us, right? And so the power is when it comes to the collective. But without individuals creating it, that top down would never happen, right? And so then if you're trying to like talk about like where is society created? Well, society is created from the bottom up. And so yes, even though top down has more power, like who's to say that that actually, like it's interesting, right? To think about like whether or not you're collective. As someone who considers herself to be structuralist, considers herself to be collective oriented. I also believe that society is created from the ground up. And so it is interesting. It's an interesting theoretical exercise for me to think about why I feel so committed to the structural stuff, the top-down stuff being so important, or being kind of like the driving forces of society, if I think society is created from the bottom up, right? So like, it just, you know, I don't know. It's a theoretical question, and so I'm, you know, if you're so inclined, I ask you to consider that as well, right? Like, how do you make sense of that, right? Like, how do you square those kind of contradictory beliefs? And I hope that, you know, a lot of times I think when we're trying to figure out our theories or figuring out how we understand the world, figuring out our belief systems, we want everything to be able to be kind of like neatly wrapped up and have there not be contradictions. But the part of what I like about theory and teaching theory and studying theory is that inherently you have to be able to deal with conflicting beliefs. You have to be able to deal with contradictory beliefs, right? And it doesn't necessarily mean that you are wrong, right? But it also means you're not fully right if you can hold these contradictory beliefs. And so what does that mean? Like, what else is there to learn? And I hope to understand that one day, right? I don't think I know that now. So, you know, Durkheim in section 5 asks us, you know, he gets us to try to think a little bit more about sociological research here. So how and why might a particular emblem have been selected? Why is that the thing that forms the common impulse? And in class on Monday, I'll try to get us to think about secular religions. But when we're thinking about secular religions, these things that exist outside of the faith context that still serve the same functions as religions. For me, I've been talking a lot about sports. You know, why is it that any particular idea or chant or totem or symbol gets upheld, right? Like, you know, like, so I'm a Ohio State Buckeyes fan. Like it's a literal nut that grows in trees, right? Like why has that item become sacred? We want to know how, and how does that become this thing that then like kind of like does it around everyone in the community? So in his conclusion, and maybe you hear my children beating at the door, you're going to see my cat walk through here in just a second. Oh, cat butt, thanks Miso. So he talks about how it is obviously necessarily on page, you know, so in the conclusion, it's obviously necessary that the religious life be the immanent form, and as it were, the consecrated expression of the whole collective life. If religion has given birth to all that is essential in society, it is because the ideas of society is the soul of religion. Religious forces are therefore human forces. moral forces, right? And so much like Marx, who famously writes that religion is the opiate of the masses, Weber next week is going to talk to us a lot about the power of religion. Durkheim is also writing a lot about religion, right? In part because at this time, religion is a central social institution. And I was hoping if we were going to have class without like the power being out, that we would be able to debate the role of religion in modern social life, right? And so, you know, for some people, religion still is a core social institution. For some, not so much, right? But at the time that these guys are a holy trinity of sociology, right? Like Marx, Weber, Durkheim, at least classical sociology. The time that they're writing, religion kind of is the social institution. Like, how does it become so, right? And at least, so Marx says it's because it's actually capitalism, and we have to trick people into thinking it's not capitalism, right? So that's his argument. Weber, we'll hear his argument next week, but Durkheim's argument is, well, because we can act like it's religion when it's actually society, right? And, you know, he's very down on this idea of people being tricked. He doesn't believe, akin to Marx, right, that we are just kind of like, we're dummies who haven't been enlightened to the point of understanding what's happening to us, which ultimately kind of is what Marx is saying, right? That like people are being duped by capitalism to not understand what's really happening to them. Durkheim says, well, you know, people aren't necessarily quite understanding what's happening to them, or they are understanding what's happening to them, they're just misattributing it, right? So like we know that coming together is this like wonderful thing. We're just saying that it's God because we can't make sense of the fact that it's each other, right? And then Weber will give us a much more negative view of what it is. So these videos ended up being much longer, probably because I just love this reading, right? Like, sorry, not sorry. Let me know, you know, we'll talk about it on Monday. Feel free to email if you have any questions. But hopefully being broken up into 2 videos helps a little bit. If you have any other questions about Durkheim, let me know. I'm certainly happy to talk to you about it next week. And I look forward to us being in class again, because making these videos just reminded me how much I like in-person teaching. So much better, right, than this. This is fine, right, but maybe electricity only be out a couple times. So I look forward to seeing you all again. Here's Misa one more time to say goodbye, and I will see you on Monday.